so many old friends on this call. And Basma, hi Basma.
Hello.
Hi. Well, this is a testimony to the way that people feel about Barry Gaberman, who is one of the most wonderful developers in the history of philanthropy, and had a long career at the Ford Foundation, which many of you worked with him alongside him, including me, and Jerry, who are two of the we contain Multitudes gang, along with Tamsin and Tom Lent, who unfortunately can't be with us today. This is a monthly conversation we have, and the rules are that we speak softly and listen carefully, but engage in the issues and really try to advance understanding. And we've had some fabulous people come on these calls, including people like Albie Sachs and Simkai Shigudu and the wonderful Basma Kodmani and others. And today we're gonna talk to Barry Gaberman, who is my namesake. We call ourselves Barry Squared. He's Barry 1 and I'm Barry 2, reflecting the rather different status between us. He, of course, being Barry 1, 35 years in the Ford Foundation, but having retired there from some years ago, has been, I think, as active in retirement as he was actually in the job. And, you know, some of you know his more endearing habits, like having the biggest soap collection in the entire world, which has been collected from hotels all over the universe, but also his encyclopedic knowledge of restaurants.
We've lost you, Barry.
Barry, I think you're muted.
Yeah, I think Tamsin, you just muted me. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you again.
Okay, so beyond soap collections and restaurants, we're going to talk about some serious stuff today. And we're going to, this is going to be a participative session. I'm going to ask Barry a few questions for about, and we'll kind of go through for maybe about half an hour, 25 to 30 minutes. And I'm going to ask him some open-ended questions. And one of the most remarkable things that Barry has done, which was to do a study of Central and Eastern Europe. And he was one of a group of funders who led the charge to, following the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, to reinvigorate civil society in Central and Eastern Europe and Russia, and went back with other colleagues from the City University of New York to actually take a look at what happened. And very rarely do funders put themselves at that kind of risk, actually seeing what the fruits of their endeavors were. So the first question I'm going to ask you, Barry, is just tell us about the study. Why did you do it? What did you do and what did you find?
Well, the study actually started with a naive sort of a premise. I think if you remember, in 1989, there was this incredible euphoria that was around. In fact, I think it was actually more pronounced in the United States than it was in Western Europe, frankly. And the euphoria, and you can tell it's a sort of title of this session, was that it was the end of history, that in fact, all competing political models were out the window. And this was the era of liberal democracy. It was just a matter of time till it spread everywhere and took hold everywhere. And in that, particularly independent philanthropy in the United States and in other places in Europe as well, and some bilateral, multilateral funding, looked around and said, well, what's really missing? And what was missing was civil society. and a robust civil society. So in this sort of naive way of the end of history, a lot of funding went in quite early on to build civil society. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to take a look at all of this work, or at least a slice of this work, 25, 30 years later, and say, well, what did we learn, or what difference did it make? So we went to 15 countries. There were 3 of us doing this. Bill Moody from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, who had been early in this work, and a woman from OSF, originally now working on her doctorate, named Meryl Sovner. We went to 15 countries in the Baltics, the Balkans, Central Europe, and Eastern Europe. We interviewed 250 people on those trips, looked at a lot of documents and a lot of internal assessments, and wrote the report called Sustaining Civil Society. And I think that, Barry, there's a link to where people can get it if they're interested in it. I recommend putting it on the nightstand next to your bed. It usually takes 2 paragraphs and you have a wonderful night of sleep after that. So we looked at it. And the real question for us was, what did we learn? What difference did it make? And that sort of thing. The report actually ends with about 20 lessons. And I will not try to repeat 20 lessons to you. But what we found was actually there was an awful lot to be learned, even given the sort of naivete of the way everyone sort of jumped in after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Let me step back. There was a sort of bias behind all of this that I think it's important to put in front of everyone. And the bias was that civil society was a fifth estate, if you will, in society writ large. And by that, I mean, you had the checks and balances that one normally talks about in terms of executive and legislative and judicial branches of government. And you had, on top of that, the fourth estate, the independent press. And the independent press sort of comes along because things are complicated and they get more complicated and the solutions are difficult. And there tends to be a tendency towards saying, God, if we had a somewhat more authoritarian approach, we could get things done more quickly. So the 3 branches of government and their checks and balances just aren't sufficient to stop a tendency towards concentrating and abusing power. And that's when the fourth estate came in, and that was the independent press to hold government's feet to the fire, if you will. Well, the premise behind our study was civil society was a fifth estate that worked to do the same thing. And the reason that it does not get discussed as a fifth estate that much is because we tend to look at civil society in a very instrumental way. We look at it in terms of what are the things it does. It does a whole set of services, it does a whole set of policy reviews and things like that. But if you pull back and you think of civil society in a generic way, that whole cluster of institutions working in all these fields, add a dimension to helping us not abuse, against the abuse and the concentration of power. Doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. It just means that it's a little harder to happen, and civil society is a part of that equation. So that was the reason that civil society, to some extent, was also interesting to us. Let me stop there for a minute, Barry, in case you wanted to follow up on something.
Yeah, thank you, Barry. That's a great context. I mean, what, if anything, what was your greatest surprise in what you found?
Well, let me answer that in a couple of ways. The one thing that that was a surprise was that exploded myths that we, as good practitioners of organized philanthropy, had. For example, there's a very strong bias in organized philanthropy towards funding institutions rather than individuals. And we tend to move in that direction. But what we found time and time again throughout the study was that funding individuals ended up being extremely important, that those individuals almost always ended up being on the forefront of energizing institutions or starting new institutions. So it evened that, if you will, for me. There was another thing that was interesting, and that was the whole sort of debate that we tend to have between general support and project support. I think there's a bias and a tendency to feel that particularly when you're dealing with younger organizations, that what you need to do is have a clearly defined project. Do that. But time and time again, what came back from these young organizations when it was those that were providing some modicum of general support that was the most valued, and the general support really was important in the very early stages of an organization to allow it that sort of flexibility. So that was a surprise, if you will, that countered a bias that we went into.
Yeah, thank you. And thinking about the results of the study, and assuming you had your time over again in intervening after the Berlin Wall came down, what would you do differently now?
Well, certainly one of the things we'd have done differently is we would have paid a little bit more attention to what was happening with bilateral and multilateral aid. Our focus was really philanthropy. And I do think that philanthropy was often in earlier, and we were able in the report to contrast the nature of funding that came from the private sector to that came from bilateral and multilateral. But I think we didn't give enough attention to that and to the role that it played, and to, on one level, the consistency between those who were running the civil society kind of work from multilateral and bilateral agencies, and those that were engaged in the work from private philanthropy. They really did have much the same vision. Where it really differed was the bureaucratic sort of obstacles one had to run through in on the bilateral and multilateral side, which were less true on the on private philanthropy. There tended to be a much shorter range view of things. There tended to be much tighter controls, and there tended to be a lot more emphasis on process rather than results. And those are all very interesting, and I wish we'd had more time to look at that. There's a different level of things that come out of the study that I wish we'd have had more time on. For example, it became evident that the the missed opportunity that philanthropy had was it did not understand fully the importance of building a culture of giving in each of these countries. What it did is it came in, it tended to build institutions, to do study trips for people, and to build institutions that had particular substantive agendas. They were human rights or social justice or providing services or a whole bunch of other things. But in order to sustain those over the long term from funding inside a country rather than from external support, one needed to build a culture of giving. And it was quite clear that even 30 years after, in most places, that culture of giving was not as strong as it might have been had we understood this better when we went in initially.
Mm. And I think there are some people on this call, for example, Masha Shertok from Russia, who have been really taking that issue by storm. And I hope Masha will come in and contribute to that, as others. When we've finished these questions, I encourage you all to come forward with questions, either by putting a note to me in the chat or raising your hand, which you can do via the reactions tab at the bottom of your screen, which next to it's the far right hand one of the middle block just on the right of record there. One of the things I've got from your account is be careful about actually making the assumptions of what political and social trends are in play in the world, and don't believe people like Francis Fukuyama, because things turned out very differently. I mean, I think he's got quite a lot to answer for, and because in a sense, if you look at Central and Eastern Europe now, you've got a very different and rather sad perspective on politics in places like Poland and Hungary. Barry, I mean, for many years, you oversaw the Ford offices across the world. I think there were 12 or 13 of them at one stage. You actually ran those offices in many parts of the world, and sometimes you would actually go and be the head of those offices to kind of try things out. So looking back on your career, long and exemplary, what have you learned from the study in the global South in particular that could be applied in other parts of the world, for example, the United States?
Well, the sort of logic behind, and at one time there were some 20 offices, that's less than half of those, I think, at the moment. There were some 20 offices around the world. And the whole notion behind it was that one wanted to be as close to the work as possible, and one learned and understood the context and the innuendo so much better if you were actually there and living where you were doing the work. I think that was basically the correct sort of assumption, but there were a lot of aspects of it that had to evolve over time. Remember that when the Ford Foundation set up its first offices, it was in the 1950s in India and in Egypt and in other places, and this was well before there were any significant government aid programs out there. So even though the resources might have been modest, this was they were big players in that context. And I think for some of them, including the Ford Foundation, it was hard to get used to being a more modest or marginal player in some of these areas. It also took us time to shed what I would call a kind of colonial model that we had in terms of our field offices. I think for the Ford Foundation, it began to happen when Frank Thomas was stepped in as the president. in 1979. And at that time, we started providing our grant money in toto directly to institutions rather than holding some of it back to hire project specialists from the West who would come and sit in ministries in other places and and whisper important things in people's ears. But it took a while to get rid of that model to a newer sort of model. There was always the assumption, and Frank Thomas actually articulated it when he became the president of the Ford Foundation, that he hoped that the wall between the field offices of the Ford Foundation and the domestic program, and about half and half was the resources that were being spent by the foundation at the time, could be broken down and there would be a lot more exchange of information. In his own mind, he thought that a lot of the things that we were doing in the United States, community development corporations being a particularly powerful example, would find their way to our agenda overseas. And what really happened was the work that we were doing overseas found its way into the work that we were doing domestically. It went the other way. But I think it made us sort of conscious of the fact that unfortunately, when you set up a field apparatus like that, you end up in an endless conversation, which goes something like this. The people in the center bemoan the fact that those that are in the field are unable of seeing the forest for the trees, and the people in the field bemoan the fact that those in New York are unable to see the unique sort of context that they have to work in. We foisted a compromise eventually on that. And what we did was we developed a dozen themes that we would work in. And then we said that we would work in these 12 themes across the institution, in the field and in New York. In the United States, we could work on all 12 of them because the resources were large enough. But in the field, you would pick the 3 or 4 contexts and work on those. And the hope was that that would allow us some sort of ability to compare from center to field. But it also meant that you could not pick a 13th field to work in that nobody else worked in. So you were constrained somewhat in trying to make a compromise there. Emma, I remember our trip to Gaza together. It was one of the most, it's an example of, and the reason I raise it is it's an example of what you can understand from only if you actually are in the field. We had a major issue, and that was it was difficult to go into the Gaza, and there was a concern on the part of some in the center that we therefore would have to stop our grant making there because we couldn't provide the sort of monitoring that would be necessary. I should say that that was a view that was held in New York and not necessarily consistently throughout the institution. But Emma and I went in to Gaza during one of those lulls that you could come in and had to speak to the few grantees that we had there about why we would not be able to continue support. And it was the experience of being there, talking to those grantees, watching what was going in day in at the end of the day when people were returning through checkpoints and the humiliation of it all, that sensitized you in a way to the importance of the work that was being done that you could never have gotten from New York. And that to me said, yes, trying to be in place as much as possible was important. It's sad that, with the exception of the Open Society foundations, there are very few that have field operations of any extent anymore.
Right. Thank you. Now questions are starting to come in, so I'm gonna turn over to. There are 4 people in a queue I've got here, which includes Masha, Basma, Christopher Harris, and Bongi. So I'm going to take Masha first. Your question, please, Masha. Do you want to unmute yourself and speak from Russia?
Oh yeah. Hello everyone. So great to see so many familiar faces. So I wrote my question in the chat, and I wonder if Barry, you can comment on what international donors did wrong, or what could they do differently to avoid alienating themselves in many countries where they were so active. Like, and Russia is not an exception. There are so many countries where foreign funding is considered toxic and a threat to national security. So was it avoidable from, what you know now? Can you comment on that, please?
Sure. Well, one of the things is something I mentioned earlier. I think that the end game is, can one help create a civil society that has legitimacy and is funded predominantly from resources within the country itself, and that allows you to avoid a lot of the claims of intervening in sovereignty, or a lot of the difficulties when authoritarian tendencies in regimes come down on foreign funders. So the earlier thing that I mentioned was, it seemed to me that a fair amount of work on building a culture of giving would have been important. The other thing that surprised me, Masha, it's nice to see you. I miss our old days at Wings. Another thing that surprised me was, and again, I think this is the bias that organized philanthropy has, was the importance of individual giving. Paid very little attention to it. And I think unless you had a culture of giving, it is hard to provide the kind of impetus to individual giving. In fact, in so many of the countries in Eastern Europe, when we were looking there, even though there were state incentives to individuals in terms of tax treatment, it was often unutilized, if you will. And yet, and this is actually a segue into the United States that we'll get to somewhat later on. One of the things that's important about individual giving is that it has the capacity to sustain a civil society in a way that you can't through institutional giving. I mean, for example, in the United States, 85% of giving is individual, and only about 15% comes from organized philanthropy, predominantly independent philanthropy, and more modestly corporate philanthropy. Well, the importance, most of the ink that is written is on organized philanthropy, but in fact, the vast majority of it is from individuals. The importance of that is that when you face an authoritarian regime, or a regime that is illiberal, if you will, it is much easier to clamp down on organized philanthropy. You know, there are a small set of institutions that you need to target on. If they're from outside the country, you can always play the intervention in the sovereignty of the country card. If it's from inside the country, you can harass it by auditing it and doing all sorts of other things. But if you have a very robust individual giving universe in a place, it's much harder. If you look at an example from the United States, and let's take Planned Parenthood. every time the state tries to intervene or to fight or restrict funding to Planned Parenthood, the individual contributions that come as a result of it far outweigh the threat that the regime is making to take away. It's a lot harder to go after several million people that are providing $30 each than it is to go after a few organized institutions. So one of the things that seemed to be really important was, and we found it in only seldom, was the importance of individual philanthropy. And I know you've thought about that yourself in various ways. So that's one thing I would put in there.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions in the chat that directly relate to that. One from Basma Kodamani and the other from Rasha Sansur from Palestine. I'm going to take those two contributions first, and perhaps you could respond to both of them. So I'm going to start with Basma, because I know you have to leave in a few minutes because you're being interviewed. You've got a better offer somewhere else. So Basma, ask your question, please.
The change of time is such a mess at the moment between different countries, because
I know that's one of the reasons why we are where we are. Yeah,
exactly. I just want to say to Barry, when he was talking about Gaza, I remembered one thought, which I think is a rule we should have, is when you are in a position of a donor, when you get into those positions, as we did, many of us, make sure you don't lose your empathy. And I think that happens to a lot of people. So when he says visiting Gaza, that's when it comes back, because you see it on the ground. Thank you, Barry. It's also very inspiring, everything you say. I had a question about philanthropy, encouraging, promoting local philanthropy. And in the Arab world, there's a lot of money and little organized philanthropy. So many tried very hard to make it work, and the results are somehow disappointing. Would you say there is more success in some other regions? And if there are any explaining factors to that, that would be great to hear from you.
Thank you. Thank you, Baz. Before you go there, Barry, I'd like to bring in Rasha, because she's got a similar question, and maybe you could do the same, answer them both at the same time. Rasha.
Yeah, thank you, Barry. So I just have it's more of a comment about what kind of ties to Basma's question. The idea that community, we have been trying to establish community philanthropy in Palestine, both as a way of, setting our own way of doing development as a community and becoming more active as a civil society. And it is very difficult. This is where my comment comes in. It's really difficult. Sometimes, as I said in the comment, we feel like we are swimming against the current, but a small grant that is community controlled, that people decide through a voting process that they want to support this community initiative because it really tackles their needs, instead of having a donor come and tell them that we will look at your needs within this framework. So it could be a water framework or health framework. But here you give this flexibility to the community to decide that they should not look at their needs through a framework. They can look at those needs in a different way. And it's really powerful and impactful to see that sometimes with a grant that is supported by the community, like $1,500, can really generate income and sustain a youth initiative, as we have seen examples in Gaza itself, because you mentioned Gaza. For example, I'm sorry if I'm taking too much time here, but there was one initiative where they turned olive peat into bricks, which really tackled the power shortages in Gaza. So it's interesting how you can see the creativity and the imagination of the community when they come together through community philanthropy.
Thank you, Rasha. Those two questions from Basma and Rasha are really speaking to the future as much as the past, I think. Barry.
You know, I'm glad you asked those questions. There's a category in the report at the end of the report when it talks about 4 special cases that we felt were important to highlight as a result of the study. One of those was the importance of the, if you will, the infrastructure organizations of philanthropy and civil society, and the fact that so little attention is often paid to them, although I do think it's getting somewhat better. But the fact is that there's a sort of false notion that it's more important to give your $25,000 to some sort of immediate activity rather than to support the infrastructure of civil society. The second special case that we thought of, we labeled the sort of canaries in the coal mine. And those were the human rights and social justice organizations, because very often the regime coming down on those organizations is a pre-warning of what's likely to happen more generally. The third was the importance of the independent press, and the fourth was the importance of community philanthropy, which you all have been talking about. We found that community philanthropy, as you said, often got much higher marks in terms of legitimacy than it did than other philanthropic instruments did. And I think to some extent we felt that there was a little bit of a hangover, and that hangover was that people tended to think about community foundations in a somewhat rigid way, in that there were 5 various points that they had to meet, you know, and it narrowed the field. And we liked the fact that more and more, as you talked about it, the notion was community philanthropy. And it was community philanthropy in which community foundations were an important cornerstone, but there were lots of other things that were there. And there's just no doubt that those places where, first of all, there is no such thing, it seemed to me, as a place that had absolutely no resources to do anything. And you could see that by community organizing bake sales or whatever to provide modest amounts of money for use. And in particular, one of the more interesting things that you mentioned was the sort of participatory grant making agenda, but giving circles and women's funds and participatory grant making arrangements and others were all examples of philanthropy in the countries we looked at that had legitimacy attached to them in a way that much of the individual and the other organized philanthropy was not seen as positively. I think, just to put a plug in at the moment, I think the work that's being done by the Global Fund for Community Foundations and the broad agenda it has, and the kind of values it goes in with in terms of community control of the funds and the decision-making process is really important. And the ability to link with them, I think, makes quite a difference. I want to make one other point, Barry, if that's okay.
Sure.
we found that that there always seemed to be some sort of an argument about models of philanthropy. Were you strictly a grant-making institution? Were you an operating foundation? Were you a community philanthropy group? And on and on and on. And more recently, of course, all the stuff that comes out of venture philanthropy and looking at how to use the assets of philanthropic organizations, not just the earnings on those assets. And we held a very simple notion, and that notion was that there was too much time being spent beating up on each other about our models, because if you accepted a definition of philanthropy as the voluntary capture of private funds for public benefit, that it stood to reason that the wider the continuum of models available, the more you're going to attract people in terms of finding a model that they're comfortable with and willing to work with. So we've seen the diversity of models in the field as a strength, not a weakness in general. But that doesn't deny that for the most part, we're working in an uneven playing field. And that anything that can be done to change that is extremely important. And community philanthropy is one of the places one really can make that difference.
Thank you, Barry. I mean, that's a very helpful answer. And I think, we have people on the call. In fact, Masha Shertok could describe how community philanthropy is transforming the philanthropic landscape in Russia. And actually, there are now 80 community foundations in Russia, and I've seen them firsthand, and they're doing some amazing work. I've got next question is from Bongi from South Africa, and then I'm going to go to Christopher Harris, and then somebody else needs to put themselves forward if they would like to. Hugh, yes, I've got Hugh after Christopher. Yeah, okay. So Bongi, your question, please. I think you put it.
Hi, Barry. Hello.
Bongi.
It's not my question.
Hi.
Yeah, I'm with my husband Ish, and that's his question. So you'll ask the question.
Okay.
Yes, I would like to know whether you have tapped into the religious groups, particularly the fundamentalist ones, and build on them, because it seems that they are mushrooming. There's a lot of money which is circulating amongst them. Do you have any experience of how we can redirect that into philanthropic giving?
Wow. Many years ago at the Ford Foundation, a very talented program officer wanted us to do a program with the Black church, predominantly in the Southeast of the United States. And I opposed that program, largely because I felt a strong commitment to the fact that the institution was and should only be involved in secular activities and ought to stay away from religious activities. And there ought to be a split between church and state. And this program officer actually took me to the Southeast and introduced me to the Black church. And it became pretty evident to me that the pastors in the Black church were being called on to do a whole sorts of things that were this world rather than otherworldly. And they had very little capacity to help them in that role to do their jobs. And it also became, and this goes back to the point of community philanthropy to some degree, it also became quite apparent that in many communities, African Americans saw the Black church as the only institution that really belonged to them. It was their institution. They were committed to it. They funded it, and it really did belong to them. And those 2 points sort of changed my mind. And we went ahead and did a program with the Black church that I think was a wonderful program. I think many organized philanthropy have a bias against working in religious areas. One of the interesting shifts for us at the Ford Foundation in the move from Franklin Thomas to Susan Beresford was that Susan opened the door to looking at faith and spiritual aspects in a way that we had never done before. And it seems to me that was really productive. I unfortunately don't have having been away from the game for so long, have any sort of pearls of wisdom about how one might tap into those resources. But my bias still has a caution around it, and that is that I fear sometimes that on the one hand, what was interesting is if you looked at philanthropy in the United States, and half of the individual maybe not half, more like 40% of individual philanthropy in the United States goes to support of the church and its activities. So an awful lot of it is going there. But the thing that really concerned me when I saw a lot of these development and disaster relief organizations that were grounded in the church, either the mainstream church or evangelical organizations, was that the services that they provided came along with a good dollop of getting you to believe their way. So I must say, I admire the fact that in the worst of economic times, the church's soup kitchen will always be open. I admire the fact that folks that represent those actually get out in places that many of us would never go. But I still remain somewhat wary about the dual agenda that they have.
Thank you, Barry. Turning next to Christopher Harris and then to Hugh Davidson. Christopher first.
Thank you, Barry. Let me echo Masha's earlier comment about how wonderful it is to see so many old faces in this, familiar faces, not necessarily old faces in this call. Two things, but first I have to apologize, Barry. I have to, as with Basma, a few of us have to roll off at the top of the hour for a previously scheduled thing, ironically put together by two former Ford Foundation colleagues. My comment and then my question to Barry, that one comment, just reflection, is that I think it's telling for those of us that learned our craft at Barry's knee over the years at Ford. I'm struck by Barry, your comments about both Gaza and the Southeast in terms of in the US in terms of the Black church. For those of us that have great affection and respect for you, it's just another example of how someone with substantial authority was willing to learn and change a long and strongly held view, both in Gaza and in the Southeast. It's a lesson I wish more philanthropic leaders could follow. So that's the reflection. The question is, in the original work in East and Central Europe, that was largely led by US funders. And with the benefit of hindsight, in retrospect, would you have done anything differently vis-a-vis other European funders? Would you have engaged more actively with Western European funders, knowing what you know now?
The vehicle that I think you're right, that private US foundations, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Mott, Ford, some others were in very quickly. And I think even before some of the AID money and before some of the Western European private and public money was in. I think we missed a bet there. We chose largely to do two things. One was direct grant making in Eastern Europe, and the other was pooling our money in a set of funds that worked on building civil society. And the money that went into those funds were largely funds from the U.S. And I think that had we been less blinded by this sort of euphoria and opportunity and just wanting to get in there and do the work, we might have spent a little more time with colleagues in Western Europe to come into larger pooled funds together. And the reason I say that is because the vehicle of the pool fund itself was a very powerful vehicle. And it was in a number of different ways. For example, almost all funders will think in terms of a 5-year horizon, very seldom beyond a 5-year horizon. But when they got together and they worked in a pool fund together, what was interesting is they tended to think in terms of a 10-year horizon or more. So the structure made a difference. It gave them sort of a confidence to stick with it longer. It also ended up with more resources being available because funders that worked directly did not curtail their direct funding to join a pooled fund. It was quite additive in most cases. It also served to share the risk because when you're together, 5 of you or so, providing resources to a pooled fund, there's a comfort in being together. Because the pooled fund set up mechanisms where the grant making itself was done by local and the bureaucracy of the funds were run by people in local areas, it trained a group of people in the whole sort of art of grant making and oversight. And finally, let me leave it at that. So I think we missed a bet by not working with Western European colleagues at the time. We would have enhanced the amount of resources available, had more institutions committed to the work, if you will, and that was important.
Thank you, Barry. I'm now going to go to Hugh Davidson of the H&S Davison Trust, based in the UK. Hugh, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question or make a comment? Then I'm going to Borislav, who's signaled he'd like to speak to. Okay, you first. Unmute yourself, Hugh. Hugh, you're muted.
Mute. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, go.
Right, okay. Yes, thank you very much, Barry. That was fascinating and really valuable. I've got a question for you that I know that the other Barry's keen on too, and that's on the distribution of power between the funders and the people in the West and the people on the front line who had lived there for a long time. And my experience both in business and elsewhere in philanthropy is that most of the answers are actually on the front line, but the people on the front line either don't have the money, which is often the case, usually the case, or they're not listened to. They don't have the voice. So how do you, we got these Westerners with big education, international knowledge, lots of skills, all very valuable, and then people on the front line who might have lived in the same town or city for decades. How do you achieve an equal voice between those two parties, between the people living on the front line and the people just visiting the front line?
It's a great question, and I'm afraid that we all fall short of that. There's such an unequal or imbalance of power in the relationship. You know, it's even in approaching a grantee and a grantor. You know, here you have the head of a major civil society organization doing an incredible amount of work. Normally, that person ought to be talking to the head of the philanthropic organization. That's the sort of parallel, if you will. But who are they talking to? They're talking to often a much less experienced, much younger program officer. So it starts at the very beginning, this unequal power relationship. I like to think of it in terms of what we mean by collaboration. You know, we use the word so loosely, and it's always used to describe things that are really not genuine collaborations. For example, the fact that a few funders may fund a similar project somewhere at very best is joint funding, and it's got nothing to do with collaboration. The fact that a few funders might get together and work on an initiative and decide to all fund a particular initiative in a place is a sort of partnership relationship among funders, but it's not a collaboration. A collaboration is when you have around the table those people that are going to provide resources, both financial and intellectual, and those people that are responsible for operating the activity itself. And they have voice in, and all of them had voice. The problem is that it means that people have to give up some of their sovereignty, if you will, in that sort of a relationship. And that's often the very hardest thing to do. And it also takes time to build a sort of trust. So my own feeling at the foundation was you just did not have the resources and the time to do everything as a genuine collaboration. But those important things were worth the time and the effort in terms of what was what needed to be done. I am afraid that you know, imbalance in power is something that it's very, very difficult to get rid of. I think the place that gets the closest to it actually is in community philanthropy, where more and more donors recognize that the genuineness and integrity of the operation has to do with the local decision making and control over local decision making. But to be a bit of a fuss budget, remember that even in local philanthropy, those that are in charge of making the decisions on the resources are in a power position different from those outside it. It's a real conundrum. And the only thing I can think of is you keep working at it. And let me make a pitch in terms of organized philanthropy. You know, in the United States, up until the Second World War, by and large, philanthropy was run by, bright generalists. And the important thing about that was that they tended to care about institutions and building institutions. And as a result, they tended to support institutions with rather flexible program and general support. After the Second World War, what began to happen with philanthropy in the United States is that we tended to hire more and more specialists. You now had agricultural economists and anthropologists and political scientists and health specialists and all in all. And this is sort of the unintended consequences of what seemed like a really good thing to do. what happened is those folks came in and they were interested specifically in that area that matched their disciplinary expertise. And they cared less about the institution. And you can graph this in the United States, that as philanthropy professionalized in terms of these disciplinary specialists, the professionalization of philanthropy goes up and core support for institutions go down. And more, what you have is project support, rather tightly with tight parameters around the disciplinary interests of the people you've hired. Now, no one is arguing that we ought to go back to an area where we fire everybody that knows something about a subject. But what we did learn from that is that philanthropy is a dual disciplinary endeavor. You come with one, and that's your discipline in economics or agricultural economics or health or what have you. And there's another one out there called grant making, and that's something you can learn and something we can teach. And my hope was when we started something called Grantcraft, which was then spun off to the Foundation Center, and now Candid, I guess, is the name. I have to get used to that. You will find a whole set of guides about, how to handle particular issues, from endowment grant making, to how do you look at a field, to how do you collaborate, or what have you. And all of that is meant to say, there is this second discipline out there that you could learn. And my hope is that what happens is the consequence of recognizing that is, number one, you get back to a model that is comfortable with providing more flexible support to institutions, number one. And number two, you get closer and closer to the point that you recognize the unequal power relationships and how important it is to have the implementers at the table with the funders talking over what the initiative should be. And I'm not sure that's quite happened the way I would have liked to have seen it as a result of Grantcraft, but that's the right direction.
Very good.
Thank you very much, Barry. What I'd like to do now is to turn to Borislav. I'm going to go back to Ish in South Africa, because I think he asked a really good question to see whether he'd like to follow up with a supplementary. And then I think we'll turn to Barry for a kind of final wrap up and a kind of reflection on this session. So Borislav, you're part of the Central and Eastern European community and have got a unique perspective on this. So would you like to make a comment or ask you a question?
Yeah, one comment and one question. Thanks for this fantastic conversation. I started with an individual grant. My first individual grant in Bulgaria was in February 1990, and it was a grant to receive a train ticket to go to Strasbourg to study human rights law, and I ended up not being able to use it fully because of the wars in Yugoslavia that started, so I got actually stuck. But and now I'm managing a portfolio that includes grants to Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. So I don't know if there's any learning or any fear in that trajectory, but it tells its own story. But my question is about the phase of philanthropy, which is probably the most unglorious one, but it's a super important one, and that's how you exit a field or a program. So Barry, I wanted to ask you about your experience and learnings from tie-offs or the exits. What's the key learning, and what would you do differently knowing what you know now from that exiting? The foundations, not everyone exited, but the Ford Foundation did exit, work in Eastern Europe. What did you learn?
It's nice to see you on this call.
Nice to see you. Yeah.
And I last saw you in Messina, I believe, in 2017. Hi. Barry, would you like to go for that?
Sure. Well, no matter how many times you say it, the notion of the exit strategy is heard differently by funders on one side and those running the actual programs on the other side. So you know, I suppose at first I think it's important to be absolutely clear of what the intent is. But secondly, I think it's important to be humble enough to know that that a marker that you make at one point in time needs to be open to reinterpretation as time goes by, and the reality of what you're able to do comes to the forefront. In almost every case of these funds that there were 5 pooled funds that we looked at in the study, they had a definitive endpoint, and in almost every case, the people who were tasked with implementing the work pleaded to extend it, and it seemed to me that by and large, in hindsight, they were right, that we were onto something, and it needed, we were naive about the timelines in all of that. Having said that, I think there are some tools that one can look at. One can look at tie-off grants that, if constructed in the right way and generous enough, buy some time for institutions to be able to adjust to a new reality. I know that many foundations hate it, but one can look to endowment grants. One of the things that came up in our study, counter to what most funders are willing to discuss, was the importance of doing things like buying office space at a permanent that resulted in a permanent asset that the institution could control, and the importance of those things, particularly at dicey times when things were difficult. So, you know, it's I think we can learn. I think there are ways that that one can, in fact, deal with it. I do want to make a comment on the earlier point you made about the train ticket. One of the things that we learned also was the importance of study tours. Now, if you talk about study tours to most organized philanthropy practitioners, the next word that comes into their head is boondoggle. You know, but yet time and time again, those people in those very early days after the fall of the wall, who went on study tours in places in Western Europe and the United States and looked and saw what possibilities were the very people that came back and started organizations, or you know, added energy to organizations and became the sort of next generation of leaders. So it made me sort of rethink what I would have thought at one point might have been a boondoggle to actually be at an early stage a very useful kind of activity to engage in.
Thank you, Barry. You're showing your ability to learn from mistakes, which is absolutely great, and actually all too rare in the field of philanthropy, I'm afraid. And you're a shining star when it comes to that. I'd like final question to go back to Ish and see whether you wanted to elaborate any further on your initial question, which was a great one.
I'd like to take, if you will, what's happened in Eastern Europe and other places and apply it to recent sort of political activities and what's happened in the United States as just a closer, if you will. And it goes back to the notion of, in our own bias, the importance of civil society. I mean, we've recognized that the public sector, the for-profit sector, and the not-for-profit find their comparative advantage. And it's when you play to those attributes that define the comparative advantage, that you craft the best programs and policies that you can. It used to be that it was very easy to define the bad guys from the good guys. You know, the bad guys generally came with guns. They took over in a coup, often military, not always, and tried to run the government in that way. And it was easy, but in recent years, that's not the way things happen. Sure, there are examples, maybe Myanmar and other places, but that's really not the way it happens anymore. The bad guys do it now through the legitimate ballot process and incrementally. And over time, they increasingly can take in the authoritarian values, whether it's labeled illiberal democracy, but you can see it in Poland and in Hungary in particular, and in other places. Well, the question that was interesting to me was that you had a parallel experience in the United States, in that you had someone that had very little interest aside from self-aggrandizement and retaining power for personal benefit. And we came very close to the precipice, I think, in the United States. And it was a good lesson at how fragile liberal democracy can be. But here are a number of things that I would say in the United States that in the short run saved us. Number one, the integrity of the election was not breached. Lots of attacks against it, but it was not breached. Number two, the courts held in the United States, and that was really important. Number three, civil society held, and a lot of that has to do, I think, with the individual philanthropy point that I made earlier. So those were, things that that were very important. The last one was the independent press held. So because of those, we were able, I think, to dodge the bullet in the short run in the United States. But the battle is not over. You now have in the United States two forces. One force understands demographic reality in the United States. We will shortly be a country that does not have a single majority racial or ethnic slice of the population. And it says that the only way to stay in power is to open the political process so that everybody gets to vote. You've got another party in the United States which essentially takes a different tack. And that different tack is that it recognizes the demographic reality, and its answer to that is, how do you suppress the vote, particularly in those communities that are likely to vote against their more conservative viewpoint? And that is the battle that's being fought now. And it'll be interesting to see that whether the courts and those other things hold in the United States as this new battle is fought. We dodged the bullet this last time, and it doesn't mean that war is over. But an awful lot of the things we learned in Eastern Europe that showed that the courts were not immune, that the electoral process was in fact breached, that civil society was put under enormous pressure, and that and other things that happen can happen easily. And what we would have thought in the United States was an incredibly robust democracy. And it's a real shock to wake up and understand how fragile it is, and how lucky we were this last time around in dodging the bullet.
Thank you, Barry. I mean, that's really powerful defense of the argument for the power of civil society, because sometimes that's all that separates us from mayhem, disorder, and actually the destruction of all the things that humanity that we care about. So and it's great to have heard you talk in this very frank way and not being in any way kind of self-promoting or trying to put a good gloss on the things that that were sometimes wrong and sometimes didn't work properly. And I think we should all be asking those kinds of questions. When we had a conversation in preparing for this, you said, and I think is really important, is we don't prepare for the unintended consequences of what we do. And once that's one mistake we make. And another is when we've embarked on a path, we don't look at it carefully enough to see what else could be done. We don't look at the counterfactual. We don't look at the opposite and actually include the people that we need to in actually solving that. And it's really sad that what we thought was the end of history in 1990 is actually very far from it, and we've got very big battles ahead of us if we want to save our world from the clutches of an authoritarian, damaging order that actually cares little for empathy and respect for people. So anyway, this has been a great conversation. We meet as we are multitudes in this private, well, it's not private because we publish it, but in this kind of space in which people are encouraged to talk freely and honestly and openly and with respect for one another on the third Thursday of every month, usually later in the day. The really smart ones among you will have noticed this is the fourth Thursday in the month. We couldn't actually do it in the third one, and we wanted to get hold of Barry to have this session. And I think that so many of your former colleagues have turned out to actually see you, Barry. It is a testament to the regard that people actually hold you in. And you are one of the most popular people in the field and one of the most knowledgeable and wisest. So thank you for this. Thank you for all of you coming along. I put the link to the report in the chat. I'm sure as the report, as this, we'll be in touch with you. You're on our mailing list. You're very welcome to come to these discussions. They're always going to be free. They're always going to be like this. We're not accepting sponsorship. Nobody's owning these conversations apart from the people that came along. And I'm sorry if I've missed anybody's questions, but I think other meetings are taking place and we've kind of lost one or two people, unfortunately because of scheduling clashes. But thanks for coming, and do come back because we will promise, great conversations like this in the future.
Thank you.
So wherever
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a great day.